is on.
All right, great. Hello, everybody. It's 6:03, and I am bringing this committee meeting to order. Mrs. Bites is going to be the temporary chairman, so I guess she'll bring it to order. Let me just give this is Connor Kurtz speaking. I'm going to give a brief overview of the committee. This is the first meeting this year of the new committee, which is comprised of Connor Kurtz, chairman, Carol Bites, and Suzanne Duncan, members. The committee is charged with examining district policies and administrative guidelines and reviewing them to make sure they're up to date and perhaps recommending changes if there are any that need to be enacted. The administration works with us to do this, and typically how it works is they will bring forward the policies that they think need to be updated. In addition to that, they will bring forward the changes that they would like to see made, and then we discuss them in committee before passing along a recommendation to the board. This meeting is a little bit different because with the transition in superintendents, the administration has not yet brought us any policies to review this month. However, some of our members, especially Mrs. Bites, were very interested in discussing current policies and changes that we would like to see made to those policies.
Connor, excuse me 1 minute.
Go ahead.
Dr. Sanker has just joined us.
Okay, great.
Hi, Connor.
Hi. So that is where we stand right now. Next month, I hope that we will continue to review policies that are brought forward by the administration. But for now, we're just going to be having a discussion tonight and reviewing the policies that the committee would like to look at. So now that we've done that, I guess we should move on to roll call. Mrs. Bites, if you would read the roll call for the committee.
Carol Bites. Present. Rich Martino.
He's ex officio.
Oh, okay. Mary Beth Forsha.
Well, Mrs. Bites, the committee is myself, you, and Suzanne. So,
okay.
Because you're temporary chairman, if you could just state those names, then we'll respond present or not.
Connor Kurtz.
Here, by phone.
Carol Bites, present. Suzanne Duncan.
Okay, thank you. I just want to make sure that that's reflected in the minutes. Now, procedures for public participation. If there's any members of the public here tonight who would like to speak, because we have a low number in attendance, I'm guessing we could facilitate more of a discussion-type meeting. Of course, that'll be up to Mrs. Bites to determine when to recognize members of the public and administration, as she is the temporary chair. So with that, are there any questions that I could answer or any questions for the committee?
Say none.
All right, great. Well, let's move on to the first item on the agenda, and that is, hold on a second. The first item on the agenda is old business, and that is just trying to figure out how we're going to be moving forward with the administrative review of policies that we began last year. Dr. Sanker, can you provide the committee with an update on what Dr. Otto really instructed you during the transition? Because he was really the one, as far as I know, that spearheaded this effort among the administration, and I wonder how he prepared you to fill his shoes in this regard.
He told me to tell the board that I had enough on my plate and this should sit till the new superintendent came in. That's
okay.
That's what he
All
said.
Right.
That he did acknowledge to me that he was very active with moving policy forward, but he said that there wasn't any degree of urgency with doing this, and he said that I really should put my time with other committees and the other things that he left for me, which he did.
All right. Well, thank you for telling us that. Does the committee have any opinion on how we want to move forward in this interim phase between superintendents? So, Mrs. Bice, do you think, what are your views on, should we just meet as a committee and discuss what we think should be changed and move those recommendations onto the board,
Yes.
and then wait until the new superintendent is in before continuing with the more rigorous process of kind of going through every policy with a fine-tooth comb? Is that how you prefer to do it?
I
What would you
prefer
like?
to do it that way. The issues that come up now that are timely, I'd like to attempt to move forward with them, and maybe the step-by-step review that in the process of the previous committee, we can resume that at a later date. But
Okay.
advance.
Yeah,
the
I
policies
definitely
that
don't
are-
think there's a need. I don't think we can really stop looking at policy altogether. And if there's anything the board would like to task us with looking at as well,
Right,
I think
agreed.
we should do that.
I agree.
Okay, these meetings will just be, I guess, focused on what, and I think that might be a good idea actually, because I know we have a lot of new board members coming in, and they might have a lot of policies that they want to look at.
Right.
And maybe they don't fall within that typical cycle that we're doing of
Right.
revising every policy. So if there's anything new board members really want to look at, this will be a good time while we have a little bit of a break.
Agreed.
Perfect.
And
Okay.
And typically, Connor, this is Dr. Sankerkin. I've worked on policy committees my entire career as a superintendent, and a lot of the recommended changes for policies come from the policy review committee from PSBA. So because they're reviewed there and try and tie into legislation that's just been passed and so forth, they make the recommendations on what policy language needs to be changed or additional policies that need to be added. So when they come in, I'm sure that Sandy notices that PSBA information will come into the superintendent's office. I can take a look at what it is and certainly let you know what's out there that they would like to have changed. And if it's not a big issue, we can just go forward with some of the routine board policy upgrades that we need to do.
Great. Yeah, I think that's a good idea. That was one reason that this committee was instituted by the board after Dr. Rowe requested it, because a lot of our policies were out of date. So if we're continuously keeping up on what PSBA is sending us, if that just could come to the committee, we could tie that into our policy if it's a mandate. And if not, we could look at what PSBA is recommending and we could tweak it to fit our own circumstances here at Daniel Boone. So it's definitely something we'd like to continue.
And the other piece to this is that before anything's finalized, the solicitor reviews it
Yes.
as well.
Yeah, and that's how it's been. How this committee has worked. I went over it a little bit at the beginning, but I'll continue. The committee will, how it worked for the past year at least. We would really brainstorm different ideas for in policy when we were thinking about making these changes. Then after we came up with our recommendation that we were sending to the board, the solicitor reviewed it prior to the first reading. That's how it's worked, and that's how I intend for it to continue to work. And we found out that was a pretty effective way at
That's the
fulfilling
process.
our job.
That's a good process, and we probably should keep it in place.
Yeah, and that's something that I was a little bit worried about in the transition process. Some of this institutional knowledge, I guess, of how this committee worked, because this is a new committee. I was the first chairman back in 2011, then I resigned and Mr. Sermonero took over. And then we have the new committee, two of the new committee members are new, and then there's myself continuing, and we have a new superintendent. There's a lot going on. So I'm just hopeful that we'll be able to continue to move along in an effective way. But I'm glad that we got some direction from the administration in regard to how the policies are going to be coming through the pipeline from the administration to us, to the board. So I'm glad we established that. Mrs. Bice, do you have anything you need to add?
No.
If I
Okay.
could add one more thing, please. I believe the policy updates come quarterly from PSBA. So when we do get one, it will probably have multiple policies that we'll need to begin to look at, and it's time consuming.
Yeah.
Policy is very time consuming.
Yeah. Okay.
I have a question for
Thank you.
Question. Quarterly on an annual basis or on a school year?
No, annual.
Thank you.
So I'm expecting one probably beginning of March. If they are doing things the same way, and I'm not sure, they have a new executive director at PSBA, and he may be changing some things, but
Thank you.
I haven't been informed of that at this point.
All right, great. Any other comment on item 2, old business? All right,
Same.
great. Moving on to item 3, new business, is the future of the policy review committee. This is something I put on the agenda just because I wanted to discuss how this committee, really what this committee is at its heart. The committee right now is an ad hoc committee, and as you can see at the top, it says the Policy Review Committee is an ad hoc committee established in December 2011 for the purpose of reviewing the board's current policies and administrative guidelines and recommending revisions as needed. So once we finish this job of reviewing all of the policies and administrative guidelines that are currently in place, this committee will be disbanded. I had the thought, and I'd like the opinion of the committee, maybe, and I know other districts do it this way, we could change the Policy Review Committee to the Policy Committee. And instead of just reviewing the current policy, this could be a place where we look at different ideas for policy, we develop new policies, we take ideas and turn them into policy, and we continue to review policy. So once we finish reviewing what we have, we pretty much start again. I'm saying we, but by that point, you'll probably have an entirely new committee. And I'm thinking one of the benefits behind that is acquainting new board members with the policies of the district, because this is a great way to learn about Daniel Boone, I found, because you really do read every policy. So that's just a thought. That would require board action if we were to do that, and I was curious as to the thoughts of the people in attendance about that idea.
Connor, this is Carol. I agree with that notion. I'd like to see it be more of an ongoing process where we just are constantly in the process of reviewing, or writing policies and rewriting as necessary.
Yeah, how the board previously did new policies is that they would be presented at a board meeting, and they would just go through a second reading, and then they'd be voted on and typically approved. I think if we do it this way, it'll provide a little bit more oversight. And something that I've realized as the Policy Review Committee has begun doing its work, you have less and less discussion at board meetings about policy because you have so many, and most of them are minor changes. But it's very easy for a large policy to just kind of slip into that, and some members of the board might not dedicate the attention that perhaps should be to those other policies. So if we talk about them in committee and the new policies come here to be vetted, really, I think that could really help out the board. But of course, it'll be up to the board to decide that. But I'm getting, so is there a desire, Mrs. Bites, to bring this proposal to the board for discussion?
Yes.
Okay, then we will do that.
Okay.
Great.
Did you want input from other people in attendance?
If other people, I don't know, Mrs. Bites, it's up to you, I guess, as acting chair.
Other comments?
I would.
Go ahead, Mrs. Senker, or Dr. Senker.
Connor, the reason that a board works by committee is that they entrust the committee to do all the vetting and the legwork in order to produce a document and a recommendation to be made to the board. So if you don't get a lot of conversation from directors who are not involved in your committee, it's because they're trusting the work that you're doing, and they don't have the time because of their obligation to other committees that they sit on to put into it as someone who is an interest who is serving on the committee. So
Thank you, Dr. Senker. I understand what you're saying, but this is a separate issue. I'm talking about the policies that are recommendations right off the bat. We do not get new policies in this committee where we're not charged with that. We are charged with reviewing policies, and I think the board does trust us in that regard. but under current procedure, new policies go directly to the board. And what I'm saying is often those new policies just become engrossed with the, not engrossed, but they become compiled really with the revisions that this committee recommends. So my proposal at this point is to bring in the new policies and investigate them as well, pretty much as you're saying, but that's not currently how it's done at Daniel Boone.
May I speak?
Go ahead.
All right.
Connor,
Go ahead.
It's Mrs. Kramer. Being a part of Dr. Otto's policy setup, well, I don't know what you want to call it, we did bring new policies right to the policy committee, such as
Okay, yeah, I know that happened, but I don't believe that was what the board was wanting to happen.
such as
I remember there being a discussion when this committee was formed back in 2011 about how new policies would be proposed, and at least my understanding of what the board wanted was that new policies would go directly to the board. So regardless of what the practice was in the past, I'm recommending, or at least I think it would be worth a discussion to determine if we want to have new policies come to this committee or whether they should go to the board, which, as I understand it, is how it is supposed to be working now. Whether or not that's the best way to do it or whether or not that's actually happening, is my understanding that's what's supposed to be happening.
well,
Is that clear?
If we could let Mrs. Kramer finish her thought and statement, please.
It's difficult.
Hold on.
It's difficult to participate over the phone and understand when people are finished and not. So,
Can Mrs. Kramer please finish? She has an illustration of
Okay.
past practice.
Well, I want you to understand, Mrs. Bites, the policy you have on the agenda tonight, 915, was a brand new policy
Right.
that was brought to the attention of the committee. The committee has been reviewing that policy, has had it in draft, has met with
Right.
booster clubs, has met with everybody in the committee, and then approached the board. So they do bring new policies to the committee. The administration does bring new policies to the committee to revamp and rework, and has gone out, like I said, especially this one on the agenda tonight.
So in practice, Connor, they have been coming through the committee. Are you saying that's not your experience?
that is not, no, my experience is they do come through the committee, but that is not, again, I'm going back 2 years, so I don't think really many people in this room would have understood what the board wanted at that time, but the understanding was that new policies would go directly to the board. Now, that being said, if committee members want to bring up policies in this committee, like Mrs. Bites did, that's fine. And another note, Dr. Sanker, it's not your job to run the committee. If Mrs. Kramer has to finish her thought, I'd ask that Mrs. Bites be the one to notice that and to bring it to the committee's attention. Thank you. Is there any further discussion?
Connor, I thought we were going to be moving forward with changing the policy so it is clearly codified that new policy initiatives would be run through this policy, through this committee, as well as revisions.
That is something I'd like to look at and discuss. A lot of that depended, I believe, on how we wanted the policy committee to...
Isn't that something we could move forward on tonight, or are you saying it's something that has to be...
Well, I'd like to move forward with the policy if we decide to change it. I'd like to move forward with it tonight, but I think it's going to need to be presented as an actual document. So we could come up with the language tonight and then ask the administration to incorporate that into a proposal that can go on to the board. That being said, I will report back to the board tonight about what happened at this meeting, and I'll bring it up at that time.
Well, if that's the issue we're discussing, I would like to advance that regardless of what past practice has been or what the precedent is. I just want to move forward with that.
That's why I think we need to, because at the very least it's ambiguous right now, as made clear by this discussion, and that is not right.
Okay, so we can... We can kind of close discussion on that then?
Perfect.
Mr. Martino has something to add, though. Please.
Connor, I just have a question. Is it written anywhere where the policy goes first?
I believe, actually, it might be in policy 009 policy development. I believe that's in the packet that was provided to committee members, policy 9. If we can look at that quickly.
Yep, we're looking at it, thank you.
Well, it appears that once a need is,
Dr. Sanker,
yes.
please, Dr. Sanker.
Section 2 indicates that when there is a need for a new policy, that the board president refers it to the superintendent for development.
Yes. So the board does request the superintendent develop that. And then the superintendent recommends to the board a proposed policy and any accompanying administrative procedures to be placed in the board agenda.
And in section 3, it indicates that it's the function of the superintendent to review previously adopted policies as deemed appropriate by the board, and when it's appropriate to revise the policy, procedures for adoption as outlined above shall apply.
Yeah, and that pretty much doesn't even allude to this committee.
But it does allude to it because it says that once I get it ready, I have to have a vehicle that will then take it to the board. And this committee becomes the vehicle to get the policy adopted, because I bring the policies here where they're vetted, and then once it gets out of committee, the committee recommends it to the board. So this committee is absolutely needed.
Connor, I think everybody here is in agreement that the policies should be shuttled through the committee, not directly to the board. And I think all that is some wording needs to be changed in the way it's written, that the superintendent would submit the policy through the committee to the board.
Yes.
But everybody here agrees, or seems to agree. So.
Yeah, I want to make sure, because this was controversial a few years ago.
Okay.
So I want to be very careful about all this.
I don't think there's any controversy on it now, though, Connor.
All right.
Are we in agreement?
So I guess this
You'll
can
write up the policy
move on
and
to,
change it.
well, if we can,
Okay.
and Mrs. Blight, this will be up to you because you're acting chair. Can we immediately move into discussion about the policy development policy?
Yeah, I thought we already kind of did.
Well, the agenda has it going in a different order, but
Can we? I would prefer.
yes, I'd prefer that as well.
That would be great.
Okay, so now we can talk about what changes we would like to be made. Mr. Martino mentioned that it would be good to incorporate into the policy that revisions should first come to the policy committee before moving on to the board. I know that's been past practice, but when I read this policy, it seems like it needs to be represented within the policy. So recommending verbatim language here tonight, would the administration be able to bring back a copy of this policy to the committee to look at changes that they can make to that end? If the
Hold on
committee
for a
wants to
second.
move in that
Connor.
direction.
Hold on for a second, okay? Just let me review this quickly.
Okay.
So are you looking specifically at section 2 then, that we want changed?
Yes.
After concurrence by the board that a policy is needed. We want that to be changed to the committee?
I would like it to say board or committee. I want to give this committee the flexibility to develop policy, not just
Right.
kind of acting as a vehicle that the board could use to just do its bidding, but rather be more proactive and bring the board policies that the board might like
May I recognize Dr. Sanker?
I believe that this is a relatively updated policy. If you look at the date on this, it was updated on April of 2012, when you were on the committee at that point, Connor, and I think it's doing exactly what you want. I don't know that it needs any updates.
Well, specifically under
Thanks.
Section 2, though. May I address Dr. Sanker?
Absolutely. You're in charge.
I am confused on the language there, Dr. Sanker. If that's what it says, if that's what the intent is, I'm reading that differently. Can you help me with that? After concurrence by the board, that a policy is needed.
Okay, by the board or board committee. I think we could insert in there.
Right, is that good? And then we would
Yeah.
have to change the president or committee chair will refer the concern to the superintendent developing the policy. And then it should say that it comes with the proper input.
And because I think you need to realize that it's just not this committee that may want to generate a policy.
Right.
It could come out of any committee. That
Right.
And that's something we're
That's a
going to
good
get
point.
to. I have notes on that, and I'd like to incorporate that into the discussion as well. So that is why, I know the policy may look like it is new. It was adopted in 2012 when I was on the committee, and I helped write this policy. But things do change, and people have new ideas, and we have new board members. And as made clear tonight, there is some ambiguity about that. So I think we have an obligation to clear that up as possible. Mrs. Blight, if I may, I'd like to recommend that we strike the first paragraph of Section 2 and replace it with, after concurrence by the board or policy review committee that a policy is needed, the president or committee chairman will refer the concern to the superintendent.
Well, my only concern on that is, do we want to limit it to policy committee, or like Dr. Sanker said?
Well, sure. Why don't we, when I was saying that, I thought maybe we could just take away policy review
Any
and we
committee?
could have it as the committee, regardless of how we word it there.
But I think
would
we
like
still
to
want it
align-
vetted through the policy committee. Do you?
Yeah.
Is that your intention?
Yeah, maybe, like, I'm trying to think about the best way to do this. If
Right.
we give the administration a directive to come back with policy that goes to that end, can they come up with the language, or do we need to write the language here, right now, is my question.
No.
Dr.
you don't.
Sanker?
You don't need to write the language. You give me the suggestions. We will take it into advisement and come up with a draft for you.
Perfect. So I'm suggesting, Connor, as a member of this committee, that we direct the administration to change the language so that a policy can be generated by any committee, a request for a policy, and that the administration would come up with the language to address that, and then it would be vetted back through the policy review committee, though,
Yes,
so that we're not bogging down those other committees.
absolutely.
And then, of course, when it was presented to the full board, or how does that make sense?
Yes.
That's what I guess.
Would we
I
want
would-
to bounce it back off, like finance committee
Well-
also?
Well, we would, because if finance committee has something very specific and they give it to us.
What if we overlooked it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and we would give it back to them to see if that's
Yep.
their intention of what they're looking for.
Yep. And also have it vetted, I guess, through
Yes.
policy review,
Yes.
just for continuity.
Every policy, how I would like to see it, and Mrs. Blight, if you disagree, feel free to state your objection. I would like to see every policy that goes to the board coming through this committee, just so the board would
Right.
know that this policy has been examined in detail.
Right. I agree.
By some board members.
I agree. So I guess
Okay.
at this point, we can instruct Dr. Sanker to come up with the language that kind of expresses everything we're in agreement here?
Yes.
Yeah.
Is that, please stop.
There's something else I'd like to include as well. And
Can
that's just
hold on,
a line.
Connor. Can
Yeah,
Mrs. Kramer add something to that note real quick, please?
Sure.
Thank you.
That's what I was saying about the booster club. It was originally proposed, and then it came through to the committee, and then people met with the booster clubs, because they wanted the whole policy, and then everybody revamped whatever.
Okay.
Meeting, policy.
And that's
P,
how.
The Booster Club, along with Dr. Otto, and then it went back to the policy
Okay.
with the revision, and that's what you have in the draft.
Okay.
It's exactly what you guys just explained.
Okay. So in practice, they kind of have been doing that anyway. Let's just get it codified. Right?
Yes, and that's something that we need to do. We have to be abiding by our policy.
Agreed.
So if we're not, we have to change the policy or we need to change the practice.
Agreed.
And that's one of the reasons this committee exists. All
Okay.
right. On that note, I'd like to add another area to this policy, and that is just a line that says that nothing in this policy will restrict any board members' right to bring a policy forward for board approval. I don't think that's controversial at all. But when you read this policy, it seems to just direct the superintendent to be the one to do that. But let's say, for example, as Mrs. Bites, you found a policy about booster clubs and you wanted the board to look at it. I think you should have a right to bring that policy to the board and then they can consider it. Even though it doesn't necessarily have to be vetted by the superintendent. If a board member wants it looked at, then that board member should have the right to take it to the board.
Let me get Dr. Sanker's input on that.
I think that if a school director wants to bring a policy that's near and dear to them, a concept that's near and dear to them to be implemented as policy, it should be directed by the board president to come to the board policy committee, rather than it be discussed by, take time out of
The board
business
meeting.
to talk about
Sure.
it with 9 people.
That's fine.
I kind of agree.
Getting at in my comment that I'd like inserted, I just want it to be made clear in policy that nothing in this policy would take away a board member's right to request a policy be enacted. And what I wouldn't want to happen is a board member to really want a policy and then the superintendent to say that this has to go through me before the board can even consider it. I'm not saying that would happen, but I just want language in there to make it crystal clear that that can't happen.
Well, I'm not so sure that we don't want the policy review committee to have the authority to say, we don't want that looked at right now because we're working on a whole different set of policies and that might conflict. So I think we are saying something different. Not that the superintendent has the right to say, or the authority to say, no, you can't have this, but it should come to, as a request to the policy review committee. And as a committee, we have to agree to advance that initiative. Not that any board member can randomly and authoritatively start submitting policies to be reviewed or added to tax our administrative staff to task them. Are we on the same page with that, Connor?
Well, I'm thinking, again, my objection, well, not objection, I just want it to be made clear that if a board member would like to bring forward a policy, even any board member can make any motion at any time. Regardless of what our policy says, when you're around that board table, if I were to make a motion to adopt a policy that I just handed to every board member as I walked around the table, under parliamentary procedure, I would have that right.
I don't agree with that.
I know, it's not, I don't agree with it either. But we have a right to make any motion we want. Whether the board would adopt it or not is up to the board. However,
What are you trying to change in this policy?
I would just like a line. I'm not saying that's the best way to do it.
I think the mechanism is already there for any board member to come to a meeting, a policy committee meeting, and introduce a policy that they want to have considered, and that committee has that option to move it forward or not. I
would agree that that's how it's done, but again, it says under Section 2, adoption of board policy, after concurrence by the board that a policy is needed, the president will refer the concern to the superintendent.
Well, that's not. But we already talked about changing that concept.
I know, but what if the superintendent chooses not to bring that policy to the committee? It doesn't
That's
say the
not what it
superintendent
says.
is
It
obligated.
said
Well, it does say the
the
superintendent
president.
is responsible for developing a proposed policy.
No.
I don't know. I just want it to be made very clear
Okay.
that board members can bring forward policies and have them looked at by the board.
Agreed. Why don't we see what Dr. Sanker comes up with for the wording? and see
Okay,
if
yeah,
we can
we'll take a
agree on
look at what the wording that is brought forward, and then we will, because we're not going to be moving on this tonight
that.
at
Agreed.
all.
Okay, Dr.
We
Sanker.
can't move on anything.
Okay, I agree. Dr. Sanker has another comment.
Connor, you may have had an experience in the past where something was stopped, but if you really consider that the superintendent is the 10th member of the board and is there as an advisor, the only way the superintendent would stop something is to probably caution that school director that this is a policy that would be harmful in some way or another and could support it. But it still would have the right to come to committee, and the superintendent would still have the right to advise the committee that the policy that's being proposed is not in the best interest of the district or the students.
I'm just not reading it the same way that.
Dr.
More comment.
Mrs. Bites, can I respond?
Go ahead.
I'd just like to say that I have not had any negative experiences in terms of enacting policy in Daniel Boone. But on top of that, you read about other school districts, like Reading, for example, in Berks County, where they have they have a lot of issues with their superintendents. And ultimately, it is the board who has the authority in the district over the superintendent. So just because we've always had smooth sailing in Daniel Boone doesn't mean that will necessarily always be the case. And policy is to protect everybody in case you have issues like that. So just because it hasn't happened in the past doesn't mean it couldn't happen in the future. And that is why I want to maintain policy to protect everybody
Agreed.
in the district.
Comment from Mr. Martino?
Connor, just very simply, I thought Mrs. Bites said, let's see what wording Dr. Sanker comes up with. I mean, I don't think there's any question that the board has the final say, so let's see what the wording says and
Sure.
go from there.
But I mean, I did want to...
I know what you mean, but we have a half hour left and you have other things on your agenda, and I think we've already pretty much agreed to see what the wording says.
All right. Well,
Okay.
we can move on then if we're ready.
Great, thank you.
I'll send this out electronically by draft,
Okay.
okay?
Did you get that, Connor?
No.
Dr. Sanker will send it out electronically by draft.
Okay. Great.
Perfect. Okay?
Yep.
So that's
So are we ready to move on? Mrs. Bites, how would you like to proceed? Would you like to talk about the other policy we're recommending for review, or would you like to talk about the booster policy and then move on to the class size policy?
Let's finish the topic 5 while we're here.
Okay. Next up on the agenda is Policy and Administrative Guideline 117, which is class size. This was brought to the committee's attention, I believe, by Mr. Martino, who thought we should look at this policy. If he would like to make any comment, I think that would be helpful as to his thoughts, if he's prepared to. Mrs. Bites, would you
Yes, I'd
like to
rec-
facilitate that?
Yes, Mr. Martino, do you have a comment for why you're advancing this change?
Only from a budgetary standpoint, I don't want to see us limiting ourselves to less than what we actually can afford to have in a class. Mrs. Bites had sent me a code, Title 22, that specifies that the maximum of students through grade 3 is 25 students, and the maximum through grade 8 is 30 students. So whatever we decide to do has to be within those guidelines.
Well, I would recommend then that we take what is required and make that our policy. I don't think we should be being more restrictive than the law does in this regard. Mrs. Bites, do you have any comment on that?
I'd like to yield my time to Dr. Sanker for the moment.
Connor, I'm looking at page 1 of 1 on the administrative guidelines, the second page here on class size. Are we looking at the same sheet, the one with the logo at the top?
I'm not looking at it at this second, but I am familiar with it, yes.
All right, it says suggested elementary class sizes. I'm going to make a recommendation that we keep the word suggested, because at no point does the board want to put the word required in, because you're going to put us in put everyone in a very bad situation when in March, the 26th student moves into first grade, and we're required then to open up a new section when it says required. It's just not practical. We'll live with it. If we get too many kids, we would possibly come to the board for an aid for the room. But to tie the board's hands and say required, when we get to a certain number, we automatically stop, take that 26th kid, reorganize all the kindergarten classes again, upset more than just one child, but now every section in kindergarten where we begin to pull kids out, have to hire a new teacher, and find a room because one extra student moved in. Keep the word suggested and don't look for a word like required. You could say recommended, suggested, just don't lock yourself into a certain number. And you can improve the range if you want, although the range here is not bad, and we're already in grades 1 to 3 in violation of that one. We can certainly bring it up to what is recommended from the Department of Education for class size. Carol, I'm not sure what you have there for recommendation.
School code.
School code.
The
okay.
school code, yeah.
All right.
My only question is, are we hung up on the language? Because I don't see any harm in having it documented what we refer to as maybe optimal class sizes. I don't see that we're bound to these class sizes by suggested elementary, and I think that's what Dr. Sanker's saying. If we're hung up on the language, you want to change suggested to optimal. Just that's
No,
what
I'm
that
fine with
is.
the word suggested. What I wanted to change was the number.
But why? What is the harm in having the suggestion so we know when we're out of that comfort zone? This is where, scientifically speaking, the kids do the best if they're in a kindergarten this size. What's wrong with having that stated? It's not in any way requiring us. This code, I'm not seeing
it. As long as
it.
we have a document that says it's suggested, the minute we go over that number, someone is going to raise the issue that you're violating your own suggestion. And as far as, I don't know that it's ever been scientifically proven about any of these numbers.
It hasn't.
Doctor?
It hasn't. And in 3 of our sections of first grade right now, we have 25 students in 4 separate classes of first graders. So we are already over the recommended number, or the suggested number here because of necessity.
What's your experience where those numbers would have come from then?
I think they're recommended numbers that, I don't know, I haven't looked at the document you're looking at. You have it up. It's school code. Is it a BEC or, it's code? It's code, okay. The code was written in 1949.
Right.
So I think best practices are what you're looking at right here. Kindergarten, in order to get the accountability block grant, if you're using any of that money to fund the salary of a teacher, that particular classroom cannot exceed 20, because that is what the recommended number is for the accountability block grant for kindergarten. And at one point, when the accountability block grant was lush with money, back in Governor Rendell's administration, many of the kindergartens, and probably the kindergartens that were here and were full-time at that point, probably did not exceed that magic number of 20 because the grant would not offset the cost of the salary if there were more children in the classroom than what was recommended. I think for primary age, which is K to 3, I've seen third grade classes go larger than 24. 24 is a nice number, but sometimes you have to put 25 and 26 in that room, depending on what. But second grade, 20 to 24 is great, and you want to keep your first graders down around 20, 21, 22. Fourth and fifth, 22 to 26. Sometimes that's not practical. Sometimes you have move-ins and you have to take the number up. Those kids are older and can function more independently than the primary age child, and because of that, you can have more children in the room. You have to remember, though, as the numbers increase with the grade level, so do the size of the children. So you have to make sure that the environment or classroom that you put the children in is adequate to accept the growing child.
Mm-hmm.
Can I add something there?
Please, Mrs. Torsia?
Along with that, there is school code on square footage per student, and that's the bigger requirement, that if we don't have all large classrooms, which I can't say even our newer building, Amity Elementary Center, for instance, does not have large classrooms, so sticking 30 students within 4th and 5th grade in those classrooms, we would not meet the 30 square feet of floor space per child for that age, for mostly any of them within that building. Special education is very strict with the square footage per child as well. So just something to keep in mind, that they do dictate the square foot.
Connor, it's Carol. At this point, I'm questioning the wisdom of needing the whole first part at all.
Me too.
I certainly see the necessity of the second part, the minimum requirement of 10 students for a class, but I'm just not hearing from anybody why we even have suggested elementary sizes, and that's going to be a moving target anyway. If the UC codes change, then that's what we have to stick by, the floor space.
And not only that, with our financial situation, I don't think we can afford to be limited by our own policy, even in terms of a suggestion, because that is what they use to determine class sizes, as far as I know.
If we're not going to use it as some sort of guideline to know when we're in it or out of it, and at least have a sense of where we're at, and relative to where we want to be, say, then what's the point of it at all?
Well,
Dr. Sankers?
So,
may I get Dr. Sankers? Or Connor, did you want to say something about that?
yeah, I was just going to say, is this a the directive we want to give the administration to remove that from the policy and bring it back to us?
Let's see what Dr. Sanker says about that.
I would like to check with the Pennsylvania School Board Association on this, because this, I'm sure, is directed from a recommended policy change that they offered at some point.
Yeah, because it's new.
I want to see what other districts have. I'll ask them to pull some from surrounding districts, and I don't know that they're going to recommend that we take it out, because it's typical that if you're addressing the class size of secondary students, then you should also be addressing the class size for elementary. Let me check with other policies and ask our solicitor as well as whether or not that should come out.
Rich Martino, comment?
We have a square footage requirement, and we have a code requirement, and I simply think our policy should be in accordance with those requirements. I don't see why we would change it to anything else.
The only problem I have with that is then it becomes a policy that we have to constantly be reviewing to see, when we're in compliance with the PAUC code. What's the point? It's redundant.
I'm thinking these numbers were changed when the policy was last revised, because if
And we
the
missed-
school code says 25, but the recommended number is less than that, I'm thinking there was something substantiating the reduction of these numbers, and it came from PSBA. I don't think it's something that this committee or board thought of on its own. I think it came from somewhere else.
Yeah, but frankly, and I'm being very frank here, with our financial situation, I am less concerned with what PSBA recommends as with what is legal to do.
Well, there's nothing illegal with what we're doing here.
I don't see any connection to our financial situation. I don't see the word suggested has any impact on our, on our budget. I just don't
I
see it.
disagree, Mrs. Bites, because I believe that when the administrators are making their schedules for students, they look at our policy, and even though it only says we suggest it, if their inclination is to keep classes as small as possible, they are not going to want to exceed what our suggestion is. That is my thought.
Well, that would be false, Connor. Because
Connor, wait 1 second. The only thing is, Connor, they already said here today, our administrators, that they have class sizes that exceed these numbers. So that's really not the practice.
What's even the point of it then?
Right, that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah,
Why don't we
I
let
recommend we
Dr.
take it out.
Sanker?
it's a guideline. The numbers are listed in the guideline. It's not listed as the policy part.
Well, Dr. Otto said many, many times that administrative guidelines have the same force as policy. And if that's not true, then we need to change a lot of policies and administrative guidelines.
All I can tell you is if I had 5 teachers and I had 125 kids, there were 25 kids going into each of the classrooms, specifically at the lower levels, because I knew I wasn't getting another teacher. So I wasn't, kindergarten was the only class that I came forward to the board saying that I can't have 25 kindergartners sitting in a class. Academically, it's extremely challenging for the students.
Yeah.
And there is
Again, I just can't understand if these recommendations have no real meaning. I don't know. I can't think of a reason why we even include them in the policy. But we are getting kind of, we're running out of time, and I know there are other things we want to talk about.
Connor, may I suggest we wrap it up by seeing what Dr. Sanker recommends from her research, and maybe getting a listing of what all the class sizes are right now to see?
right here. Yeah, you get it monthly.
Oh, okay. So how about we review?
Yeah, we'll look at it next meeting. Again, this is just really to get all of our thoughts out there and get the administration working on the changes that we want, and then we'll vet them at the next meeting.
Okay. Why don't we leave that there then?
Well, one other thing, I would recommend that we, if possible, change that 10 limit. I would recommend 15. And you know what? That doesn't prohibit any class from being offered. It just needs to come to the board to be ratified. And I'd like to change the date for that ratification, not in October once the class has already begun, but in May when the schedules have been set. They know what the classes are going to be next year. If there's a class that has under 15 students, it needs to be brought to the board for review. I recommend bringing that number 10 up to 15.
Okay. Mrs. Torsha?
There'll be a lot of AP courses not running, Connor.
Well, that's why they can come to the board, and the board could look at them individually. And in our budget situation, that's something I think that we should look at. Not saying they won't be offered, just saying the board will review them, which is how it should be now. Looking at the policy, any class that has less than 10 students, it can't just be rubber stamped by the superintendent and then not come to the board. Per policy now, it needs to come to the board for approval, and I don't remember that happening in the past. So just make sure we're following that for the future.
Connor, I am reading that in 117 that the superintendent is authorized to approve exceptions. Well, with board approval. With board approval, right.
There's that line, too.
Dr. Sanker?
From what I understand from the high school principal, scheduling is done over the summer. So the best time to look at enrollments would be August, before school starts, not in May, because he's not going to know in May how full his sections are, and he hasn't, at that point, taken care of all the move-ins over the summer.
That's fine. Just as long as, it doesn't make sense to me that we could take away a course after it has already begun holding classes. So just before school starts, I think is the best, because that might happen moving forward with our budget how it is. If we have a class with only 7 students, it might not be offered. That's just my view, but you can't be doing it after the class has already begun, in my opinion.
If I could
Dr. Sanker?
comment further, the other thing you need to factor in, you can cut the course from being offered, but then what are you going to do with that teacher? when he has or she has one extra class period now that she sits idle when you're paying her for a full schedule and you really can't reduce her yet to half time. So you can automatically slash a class, but you got to look at what's going to happen to that staff member when you've taken a course away from what is on that staff member's schedule to teach.
Well, what would be the practice now if the course was cut at 10?
Well, at 10, they offer it. I mean,
Or 9, whatever, say,
well, if it's
It was
close to 10,
closed.
usually I had this at my last district too. My board wanted to see, and they had to approve. And at that point, they looked at the course, and if it was close to 10, they let it go. But if it was dropping to 3, 5 or fewer, then we really looked hard at what's the problem there, and let's
so
cut.
we would have that same
You would have that
situation, just at a
latitude.
different threshold.
Yes,
So
exactly.
I'm not sure that would be the reason for not advancing that. Mr. Martino?
If I may, the scenario you just brought up, that you could cut the class, but then what do you do with the teacher?
Yeah.
Well, that holds whether it's 10
Right.
or 5.
I think we just,
So,
Well, you still have the same problem, but at 5, I look at, some of the classes could be rebalanced if it's offered more than one time. But a lot of these singletons with the advanced student who takes the AP or the honors, and you get into French 5, German 5, whatever, then you've got problems. I mean, there's only going to be a few kids who
Would-
can challenge themselves.
In reality-
and I think that's really the question, is can we afford to provide a class for that few students? I don't think we can.
in reality, wouldn't we know from these AP students in May or June, maybe informally, that they're planning on taking French 6 or French 5, excuse me?
I would
So, I mean, couldn't we,
please run his numbers.
right,
I don't know
right.
when the kids schedule. I would think it's spring they schedule, and
Even if we could do some sort of interest form in May to predict the offering, so that they are offering classes that are more likely to be filled, so that we don't have that situation in August.
But let's back up
I-
to Dr. Sanker's statement. When do you have to know to be able to make an adjustment with the teacher?
I would say, I'm not used to having the schedules done in the summer. Where I came from, the kids left with a tentative schedule. So if we were going to furlough a student or a teacher down to halftime, from full-time to halftime, I would know in June that I'm doing it. So,
So,
Why?
Mr.
It-
Kirks, there's a suggestion for a policy change that this has to be done,
Course
selection has to
selections.
be done before
The end of school.
Well, it is. It's typically done, what we're waiting on is, we need to bring to the Curriculum Instruction Committee the course selection catalog to be reviewed and for us to put on for a voting session. We would have liked to have done that for January, but the agenda was pretty much full. So now we need to get this on for the February curriculum instruction meeting so that Mr. Hankel can go over his course selection, review what he has, what changes there might be, if there are any, and then offer it to the students and then get, the results back.
But
So-
if that's brought to the curriculum meeting and in turn taken to the full board, if the curriculum committee adopts it or recommends adoption, so you're saying that would allow sufficient time?
Yes, but we need to get that course selection book on the curriculum instruction committee next month, February. It's got-
Well, just saying, there's a procedure that Dr. Sanker has laid out, I believe, to the administration for getting items on board on committee agendas. If you just follow that procedure, we can get it onto the agenda for next meeting.
okay,
Okay.
thank you.
As far as 117, I think I'd like to go with your recommendation that we do change the numbes to 15 and the dates.
All right.
Then, if that's realistic to do at this point, or we
I
can,
think that's what we should do. But on that note, if we can move on to the next topic, I think that might take up a good amount of discussion.
So are we asking Dr. Sanker to change the wording on that for the next meeting too? Then.
I am, yes.
Okay. Yes, I am too. Okay, Doctor.
Okay.
I have
Thank you.
notes.
Okay, and next.
Next up, Mrs. Bites, is your proposed policy, the booster policy.
Excuse me.
Next up on the agenda is your proposed booster policy.
Yeah. Can I have some comments from Mrs. Torsha had commented online. I'd like her statement about her views on it.
Mrs. Vice, before you go on to that, maybe you can give a brief overview of what the policy is for the sake of the minutes.
915, which is really, I guess, not really our numbering. It's the
It's
it?
it is.
It is.
Mhm.
Oh,
We
okay.
just don't have one.
Okay. It's just an overview of the structure of the relationship between booster groups to the district. It specifies their autonomy, the areas that they could take responsibility for. Specifies that there's an approval process for each of the booster groups, and if they do not comply, they're not a sanctioned booster group, they're not recognized. And if they are in full compliance with this particular policy, then they have the benefits of a robust relationship with the school district and the use of the fields. And it specifies fundraising guidelines. It specifies the existing equipment, the ownership of it, and how the booster sports equipment would stay the possession of the school district. Improvements to fields would have to be approved by the school board and conducted by school board personnel. It just seems very robust, but I would like to see get the administration's opinions on it. Mrs. Torsha?
Well, because I'm responsible for approving most of the flyers that come through our office, many times I am approving flyers for fundraisers after the flyers have been out or being suggested. The way this policy reads is that all fundraisers have to be approved prior to the season for the sport. And I really like that idea. I like the fact that all the fundraising needs to be equal, which applies to Title IX, making sure that we're doing equitable fundraising, that it's not just fundraising because we have some really assertive people in one sport area and not another. So I'm not seeing a lot of equity or consistent equitable spending being spent across the board in all sports. The other thing that I like that I think would be very beneficial to this district is the fact that there has to be a comprehensive financial plan that is outlined and with a yearly or annual audit done so that we know exactly where the monies have been spent and what it's being spent on. So there's a lot of very important aspects of this policy that would be very beneficial moving forward if we're going to be relying on boosters to be helping to support our sports program. So, is this the exact one? I'm not sure, but this was a really good draft of something which we didn't have anything in place at all.
Mrs. Bites, I'd just like to say I think the policy draft is great. I think it fills a void that needs to be filled, and I think it provides a lot of guidance to our booster organizations. There is something I'd like to see added to the policy, though. I would like to see a requirement that the booster organization be a 401c3 registered nonprofit, and I'd like to see that for a few reasons. There's a whole nother list of regulations just to make sure that the organization is compliant with. In addition to that, it prohibits political activity from being performed by the booster clubs. And there's room for politics and there's room for what the boosters should be doing. And I'm not saying they're involved in politics now. I think they have been, personally, but I think that should be incorporated into the policy as well. There should be no politicking from the booster clubs where they risk having their authority revoked by the board.
Connor, on page 7, I'm sort of seeing that covered. No booster support organization shall engage in any activity outside these guidelines. I mean, wouldn't that preclude them from being involved in politicking?
I'm not sure if the policy, when I hear that, I'm not sure if it means outside of what is deemed they can't do, or is this listing only the things they can do? For example, does this policy
Okay.
is it constrictive, or is it more, I don't know, does that lock them in, or does it say they can't do anything and it's going above and beyond what's in the
I agree.
policy?
In some way, the language should be in there to address that.
Yeah, so I think, it's a little bit ambiguous how I read it. I
Okay.
prefer that it be in there very clear so that it is without question.
Okay. May I refer to Dr. Sanker?
Sure.
Thank you.
First of all, I have two unrelated thoughts here. The obligation to make each booster club a 501c3, I think can be a very great hardship. Because first of all, from my knowledge of this, and you can check with somebody with the Daniel Boone Foundation, because they're probably a 501c3. It's very time intensive to make the application for this, and in many cases, it is facilitated by an attorney in order to submit a 501c3. There's a lot more to it than just saying, I think you should be a 501c3 legal charitable organization. So I think it's really going to be a hardship on some of these booster clubs to put that requirement in. And you could do some research on that.
Yeah, so I'd like,
Or we could ask
Yep.
our solicitor to do it, but I think that's...
we can look at that.
It's nice, but I think it will put a lot of booster clubs out of business.
Mrs. Bites, could I comment on that?
Yep.
I know for a fact that the Music Boosters is a 501c3 nonprofit right now because it says it on their website, and I believe the Sports Boosters are as well. So I don't think... I know that Dr. Sanker was
good
saying it's
point.
one thing to say that we think they should be, and to be honest, that's the role of this committee, to say what we think. That being said, they currently are 501c3 nonprofits. So I don't see any problem with that, and I think it's in the best interest of the district. I think you need to have that in there, because we can't just be handpicking certain groups of parents who we want to be booster clubs and who we don't. There needs to be some type of legal framework that they're operating from within, and I think that 501c3 status gives them that framework.
Okay. Mr. Martino?
I was just curious, do we have the authority to mandate that happen?
Just say suggested.
I think we do
I
if we're
think
going to be
we do.
recognizing it. Of course, the policy will have to be vetted by the solicitor, so we'll find out.
Agreed. And I think moving forward, we should make sure this is run by, has it been run by the sports boosters?
Yeah,
And the AD?
we did run. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Nope. Has this particular one been run by anybody yet? Connor, moving forward, I'd like to see it run by all the interested parties. And Mr. Basil has a comment?
It's Basil.
Basil, sorry.
Think of Sweet Basil. If you want to call me Sweet, you can do that.
Oh, sorry, Mr. Basil is not here. Mr. Basil is here.
Yeah, we had invited both the music boosters and the sports boosters to review this policy last fall. We had a couple of different meetings with them. We edited. They had some feedback. We in turn edited. Is that what you're talking about, the booster
This
policy?
is from the Hazleton Area School District.
Yeah, I
Is
think
that
I've seen
the
that one.
specific?
But we had reviewed and gotten some feedback from them. I have to compare this to what we were working on to make sure to see what the differences were between the two.
Well, I think I'd rather
But-
just move fresh with it
It's in
and make them review it again.
Okay, well, I'm just saying that there may be some ideas that we had incorporated in the other one that were acceptable
Right.
to both parties that you may
That would
find
be-
work here. As part of that process, Subers had brought to our attention the issue of the 501c3s and, acting as political groups as opposed to just fundraising groups. And as you see, even today with the emails that are getting passed around, it's
An issue.
It's something that needs to be addressed, I think, going forward.
Okay, so we need that information before we can
Yeah,
move
second
forward. And
comment.
Dr. Sanker has another comment?
Where it says on page 2 of the proposed drafted policy, responsibilities of the district, we allude, two paragraphs above that, we allude to the fact that the purchase of equipment and apparel in excess of $1,000 by a booster club has to be approved by advance notification to the superintendent. We talk about all the responsibilities of the district, but there's nothing in here that says it's the responsibility of the district to purchase uniforms or equipment. I mean, we don't want the boys buying their own football helmets because they have to be regulated in their pads.
Yeah.
Just
I think we
briefly,
have-
where are you at on
I'm
that?
on page 2, and it's silent on buying equipment or uniforms about what is the responsibility of the district.
I think the issue we had was last year, the boosters went out.
No, that's because this is the,
I think what happened was last year, Dr. Sanka, the boosters organization went out with a donation from one particular individual for like $7 grand and bought the entire football team brand new jerseys
okay.
without the high school principal knowing about it, without the board knowing about it, without the superintendent knowing about it. And some people were upset because, as a board, we should be approving those types of things. The colors weren't quite right. And then of course we had the whole Title IX equity issue that we were, hypersensitive about. So, in our old policy, I think we were trying to address that issue of, financial reporting and making sure that the booster organizations are providing. State law now requires they're supposed to provide the board with their budgets as well as their financial statements. And I have to ask Mr. Boyer if they've done that to date. We've asked them several times.
Working on that with Mr. Subers. They've turned that Title IX policy, submitted it to the state several times, and it's come back for edits. And I just saw an email that came back again this afternoon between the high school principal, Mark Boyer, and Mr. Subers on changes on this Title IX equity thing. So we are working on becoming compliant.
Yeah.
We're not finished yet.
Yeah. Well, I think our policy needs to address the issue of financial reporting and providing budgets and being able to, work in continuity. As we said to them in many of the meetings we had, when we're trying to work hand in glove with the efforts that they're making to fundraise and provide those things that the school district does not provide. But they need to come along, and I think the problem is right now everybody's still in their camps, and they're not
Thank
willing
you,
to disclose
Mr. Basil.
things.
Connor, may I suggest we move on by having the administration get back to us on further recommendations from all interested parties? And we look into the Title IX equity wording that should be in there.
She's still there.
Connor?
Connor?
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Yes, thank you.
Sorry about that. I was on mute.
Can we move it by, go ahead.
Yeah, I think we can give the administration that directive. They have what we would like. We would like this policy with additions. We need to have the state law represented in there, and I want wording about politics as well, and I want them to be 501c3 nonprofits, which I don't know. That might be the law. I don't know. We have to figure that out.
I'd like to move with that until we heard otherwise, really good
Yeah.
reason for otherwise also. I think that's
Yeah,
kind
so-
of the foundation of this, that they're a separate organization, with their own
Yeah.
requirements for reporting and ethics, a charitable something organization compliant, I think is some of the wording that's in there,
Yeah.
that they have to
So-
comply with the,
It would be good to get the administration to work on this policy and to bring back the changes they think we need. Then when we have something on paper from them, we can discuss it at our next meeting.
okay, agreed. Good, okay for now. Anything else? Where we at? Does that cover us for tonight then?
Well, public
Public
comment,
comment.
I think, is the last item, if there's any.
Well, there is one.
Say none?
With Mr. Basil here, I brought up earlier, I've been told that the board president is ex officio on every committee.
That's correct.
I couldn't find it in the policy anywhere.
Should be in 005,
Yeah.
policy 005.
Yeah,
I'll find it for you.
you can sit in on any meeting and act as a committee member.
Well, just that, Connor, that if we can't find it in the policy, it needs to be added to the policy.
It does.
Yeah, if the administration cannot locate that, I would ask the administration come to the next meeting with that in the policy as a revision. So regardless of whether it's there now or not, at the next meeting I'd like to see a revision.
I think
With
it's-
Mrs. Bikes, do you have any objections?
I agree with that. Yep.
Okay, then that's a directive to the administration.
I will
Perfect.
look when I get home.
I didn't bring my
Mine is
policy.
in the back of my office.
Thank you, Dr. Sun.
I've never been anywhere that they aren't. You know.
Isn't it kind of like standard
standard.
parliamentary or Russell rules or something?
It is, but it's also in policy, and it may or may not be in code because they don't address committees in code since it's so old, unless it's a new section of the code.
I have 005 here. and
Okay.
I couldn't find it.
It's usually that, usually 05,
Should I
005.
move to close the meeting?
Yeah. Motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn the meeting?
Second.
Adjourned.